Welcome everybody. My name's David Wood and it's my privilege to chair London Futurists. Economics has been called the dismal science and the miserable science. It sometimes seems to make very depressing assumptions about human nature. For example, some economists claim that the business of business is business. But can economics instead be a tool to design better solutions to one of the most critical issues of our time, namely the threat of possible runaway climate change induced by the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere? That's the suggestion made by our speakers today, Adam Hardy of EcoCore and Professor Steve Keen. I'll let them introduce themselves and explain their ideas a whole lot better than I've just done, and then we'll move into an extended question and answer session. Welcome, Steve. Welcome, Adam, to London Futurists. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, David. I am Adam Hardy, and I'm coming to you from London. And I am going to go through the carbon currency based on carbon allowances concept that we're putting forward. The first thing I'm going to do is give you a very, very quick rundown on global warming and climate change and the impact on the economy and society that it's going to have. Just to put it in context, I always find it helps to prepare people for the extent to which they're going to have to go to sort the situation out. You should be seeing my my much younger photo and the intro there. CO2 and the other greenhouse gases are essentially just blanketing the planet and capturing the heat from the sun that before anthropogenic global warming and the Industrial Revolution would all just dissipate out into space. And the extent to which we have achieved that is really quite phenomenal. We have put 2,500 billion tons of CO2 into the atmosphere. That's 2,500 gigatons of CO2, which makes CO2 the most produced man-made substance on Earth. And of course, there's all the other methane and nitrous oxides and so on as well. And when you put that into, when you visualize that, this is a pile of 1 ton blue bubbles of CO2 that New York City would produce in a year. I think that's the year one. They have a great video of the bubbles starting out on New Year's Eve and growing into this huge mountain by the end of the year. And of course, this happens in every city across the globe, and it's not just restricted to cities. It covers everywhere from the marine environment through to farming and so on. It is just, we are just hugely efficient at pumping CO2 into the atmosphere. And this is the effect. This is the hockey stick chart from Professor Michael Mann. And that was from 2016. And it's now gone up from about 1 degree C rise to 1.4 something, and looks even more extreme. Essentially what we're doing is we're altering the planet that we live on in this massive experiment that we don't know the outcome of. We have very good climate scientists, and they're extremely good at defining a lot of things that are happening to the physical world, to the Earth system, as they call it. And what then happens is, and this is what the IPCC occupy themselves with for a lot of the time, is then trying to translate those risks into risks that will actually have a social and economic impact on us. And so what I've done here, for want of anything better out there, which is very difficult to find anything that does this, there are various different scenarios that you have. And I started at the top with the sort of business as usual, and everything's fine, and we're going to get through this. It's not going to be a problem. This is the type of one that Bjorn Lomborg would be saying is definitely going to happen. We don't have to worry about anything below that, according to these climate deniers. And as you go down, they get more and more severe. So I've done a bit of very simple color coding on there. So right down the bottom, you've got the you've got the other end of the spectrum where basically everything goes tits up for human civilization. We have the hothouse Earth scenario, which is runaway climate change, where we would end up in 1,000, 10,000 years with a planet is pretty much the same as Venus. Actually, I say 10,000 years, but I have no idea what time scale that would be on. But essentially,
I'll correct. We will not hit Venus. I'll correct you on that one. Technically, we're not going to hit that level. About the maximum increase in temperature would be about 14 degrees Celsius over the current average, but it's still unlivable for the life that's evolved on the planet, particularly life evolved during the Holocene period.
Okay, yeah, brilliant. So essentially, extinction of species and everything in between there, from the top to the bottom, is the various different things that we can expect. And what is certain, though, is that the less CO2 we put out into the atmosphere from now on, the higher, the greater the probability of the scenarios at the top of this list. And the more CO2 that we pump out, and if we carry on as usual, business as usual at the moment, pumping out what we do, then we can be fairly certain that the scenarios down the bottom will have a much bigger probability of occurring. So 1.5 coming in there, there's now a debate about what 1.5 degrees C of global warming represents, probably somewhere in the line of, well, really, let me go on, actually. It's not my place to try to quantify these things. I mean, Extinction Rebellion would say that at the bottom of the list there, you've got these scenarios where the probability is possibly 5%, which is a 1 in 20 chance of happening. And the standard communication technique is say, well, you've got a 1 in 20% of something really bad happening. Now, if that was a plane flight that you were going to get on and somebody said there's a 1 in 20 chance of the wings falling off and you dying, you would certainly not get on that flight. That's just that's the way human psychology works. But really, the fact is, it depends completely on how much CO2 we manage to keep out of the atmosphere. So let me go on from there. The thing that makes it complicated are these so-called tipping points, which are essentially components of the physical climate system, the Earth system, which exhibit nonlinear dynamics. That means that it can be stable and remain stable and remain stable, and then it hits a tipping point, and then it just goes, and you can't predict where it's going to end up. So things like the West Antarctic ice sheet, I'm not quite sure, they haven't labeled which one of those down the bottom at the Antarctic is the Thwaites Glacier, but there's been a lot of news about the Thwaites Glacier, which is, they think is going over a tipping point essentially right now. And what the climate scientists do is, because of the nonlinear dynamics of these components, they're very difficult to model. They're very difficult to put into these huge climate models that run on the supercomputers that they have access to. And essentially, they can put in 1 or 2 and see what the interaction is like in between them. But what they can't do, what they absolutely can't do, is put them all in. There's just not the supercomputer power available to do that. So essentially, what we're saying is that we just don't know what these existential risks are at the bottom end of the scale. We can't quantify them. So it's just to point out that we are, to a certain extent, flying blind. And what are we going to do about it as a civilization? Now, the last 2 years have been a bit different with COVID and the war in Ukraine and the energy crisis. So that might mark a break. But if you look back at the evidence of what humanity has managed to do to tackle the situation, it doesn't look very good. This is a graph of the climate negotiations set on the rising emissions, which is, yeah, pretty depressing, really. And so what we need is an appropriate response. And one thing that we can be grateful for, the silver lining of this, of the energy crisis that we have at the moment, is that the governments are now doing things that under normal circumstances they would never have considered possible. For instance, the rationing of gas supplies to big industry in the coming winter because of the pipelines from Russia being shut down. And this opens up the whole question about how can you use control of supply to tackle the situation. We have the ability to say, look, we're only going to take this much from the fossil fuel producers, and we're going to leave the rest in the ground. So the option is not only to sort out the current situation, but also to tackle the climate crisis and the CO2 emissions of society as a whole, and hence the carbon currency concept. Which basically I've put down a few bullet points there for the results that we're looking for. Basically, I'm going to rattle through this quite quickly. The reason why politicians don't like to cut down the amount of stuff available to people is that everybody always wants more in our society at the moment. They want to be able to go out and have the freedom to spend what they want, where they want, on what they want. And the idea that you stop people having these flights and these the tanks of petrol and their meat diet and so on was, up until recently, kind of taboo. But now we're actually looking at that. Now we're thinking, there's a lot of people thinking this is possible and acceptable. So not only the idea of a carbon currency is, it gives you the option to spend your carbon tokens that you're given wherever you want to. So you would not be told not to fly, you would not be told not to fill up your car or buy your meat, but you would then be controlled, and you would not be able to go out and just go the whole hog and essentially live a really carbon intensive lifestyle. What would happen is that I assume that a government would come in with to set the initial level of carbon allowance that people are given at the average amount. Now, the average amount in the UK would actually be, for the majority of people, quite sufficient, because the distribution of carbon emissions by our population is so skewed because of the huge carbon footprint of the rich and the super rich. So it means that the average carbon allowance would actually more than suffice for the median UK citizen. The median UK citizen's carbon footprint is significantly less than the average citizen's carbon footprint, which is means that the people who want to maintain those really carbon intense lifestyles would have to go out and buy the extra carbon tokens that they need, that they don't have in their allowance. They would buy it from people who have extra allowance left over once they've done with their own carbon footprint. And this would obviously create a high incentive for the people having to spend all of that money to not actually do all of that carbon intense behavior. And it would provide a very useful subsidy, essentially, for the lower half of the population who are struggling on with the situations that come up like we have at the moment. And what happens is, essentially, everything is given two prices. So you've got your carbon price and your cash price. So you go out to the shops, then you take your carbon card with you. And this is a very brief, a very simplistic rundown of how it works. The government works out what the climate targets are, and they say to the carbon bank, okay, you've got to distribute this to the citizens. So the citizens end up with a carbon account, and they get the tokens put in. They can then go out and spend them. They would spend them on everything, just like they would spend cash on everything, unless they got it for free. And businesses that are selling to the citizens would be demanding carbon tokens as well as money. And the businesses would also trade between themselves in the supply chains. And then it would come down to number 6 there. The energy providers and the fossil fuel suppliers would be taking large amounts of carbon tokens from their customers for the provision of their carbon intense supplies. And at the end of the chain, the fossil fuel suppliers would have to earn enough carbon tokens from selling all of their products to justify under audit the amount of fossil fuel products that they pumped or dug out of the ground. So if they dug out a gigaton of a megaton of coal, then they would have to provide under audit to the government a megaton's worth of tokens to prove that they had the license to do that. And that is essentially the connection that keeps the carbon price in line with carbon targets, with the climate targets. And this shows the quick maths. Essentially, the first block there is, it boils down to, you would get if one carbon token is worth a kilo of CO2, then you get about, on the average carbon footprint in the UK, you get about 19 tokens per day, which equals about a tank of petrol a week. And if you go down that list, you can see the international flyers among you will be looking at the London to Hong Kong return will cost you 3,500 tokens, which is essentially half of your annual allowance. And that sort of puts it all into perspective. And because the carbon tokens are demanded by business, they put the carbon price on everything that they're selling. Then they have the carbon price, the carbon token, the signal right under their nose, and they're going to be working with that every day. And this will basically just supercharge innovation, because they will just be so aware of their carbon account and needing to balance their carbon budget. And it also draws on the employees coming into work and the entrepreneurs. They will bring in the carbon literacy from their domestic lives where they're using carbon tokens every day. They'll be using that same carbon literacy in the business to work out where can they cut down on their CO2 emissions. And the whole of the public sector would be covered by this as well. So the NHS, for instance, at the moment, the way they work out how good or how bad they are is they work out the carbon footprint for the whole NHS. Just one bunch of consultants goes in and does a massive, massive report and then distributes it out to everybody who's concerned, saying, look, this is where it's all coming. This is where all the CO2 emissions are, and this is where we need to cut it down. And then they hope that the people in the various different departments will do it. Under a carbon currency, what would happen is that every budget location in every department that runs a budget, a cash budget in the NHS, would also run a carbon budget. And so it would bring the carbon price signal right down into those departments in the NHS that they're looking to save money. They would also be looking to save CO2 emissions. And of course, it would apply to the armed forces as well. The American armed forces apparently have I'm getting a feeling I'm going to be corrected soon on this, apparently have a larger carbon footprint than any of the individual US states, apparently. It's just absolutely massive. But assuming that they're using the carbon currency and they're putting a carbon token payment for everything through the books, then they would be very aware of where their carbon was, where their CO2 emissions were going, and be a bit less wasteful with it. It would also provide a lot of controls at on the fossil fuel producers, the oil and gas producers and the coal mines. They would be, the key point is that they would be audited for what they dug up. So if they dug up or pumped a megaton of fossil fuel out of the ground. Okay, now I don't want to get it confused about the numbers right now, because I haven't done that, about how much a ton of carbon is in relation to a ton of CO2, but essentially that would be the government department's business who are keeping audit over this. Essentially what they dig up, they would have to pay for in tokens, not what they sell, but what they dig up. So then they go to sell it. That means that if they've been spending the whole time flaring off tons of this stuff that they paid carbon tokens for, then they will realize that they've got a big hole in their account. They're going to have to start looking at saving some of the fossil fuels that they're just using up themselves at the moment without any responsibility at all. And also we've got carbon drawdown would be paid for from either from the government or from anybody concerned with wanting to do carbon offsetting. For instance, going back to the fossil fuel industry, if they wanted to reduce their carbon footprint and sell their fossil fuels like at a representative amount, say they wanted to sell a ton of their fossil fuels for a ton of carbon credits, they wouldn't be able to do that if they were burning off half of this stuff by flaring it. They could alternatively go off and get Climeworks, the carbon dioxide removal company, to do a ton of CDR for them, and they would earn the carbon tokens on that they would then be able to subsidize their fossil fuels with. That's one scenario. And of course, other carbon sinks would be funded by carbon tokens. A big forest represents a huge amount of carbon that's been sucked out of the atmosphere every year. They would be paid in carbon tokens, which they could then sell in order to keep the forest alive and stop it being cut down for soya farming or cattle ranching. And methane and the other greenhouse gases could be licensed from the government in licenses that are paid for by carbon tokens. And so that simple mechanism would keep all greenhouse gas emissions under control of the same framework and in step with the carbon price. There's the carbon budget in that pie chart there for that's practically 3,000 gigatons that the human race has emitted that's going to get us to 1.5 degrees C of global warming. And we've already emitted 2,500 gigatons of it. We've got 420 gigatons left to emit before we get to 1.5. So in a theoretical climate negotiation with all of the nations sitting around the table saying, what are we going to do? That 420 gigatons can now be priced pretty directly in cash because we've got a carbon price from the carbon currency. And that means that the negotiators can bring all sorts of things to the table as well. Like, for instance, the poorer nations can bring their debt. They can say, look, we've got this debt that we want to get rid of. So you cancel this debt for us and we'll let you have a bit more of that pie. The richer nations could bring their emissions history to the table. The United Kingdom could say, okay, we do happen to have this huge lengthy history of emitting CO2, so let's wrap this up in the deal as well. We could talk about climate reparations as well, so that could enable a completely different way of negotiating the whole global treaties on climate change. So now we get on to this second to last slide here. We get on to the cost. This cost of $1 billion was the estimate for introducing tradable emissions quotas, which was a big idea that's been going along for a long time in the UK and was looked at by government in 2008. And now the technology has become a lot cheaper and a lot more efficient since then. So that would bring down the price. But TECs or tradable emissions quotas were a lot less extensive in coverage than a carbon currency and carbon allowances would be. So you would probably have to factor up more cost there. And of course, the companies in the banking sector would be looking at doing a lot more accounting work on keeping a carbon account as well as a cash account. And so for the last slide here, I've put carbon allowances in the middle column. And on the left, we've got carbon tax, and I've used the fee and dividend type carbon tax there, and emissions trading on the right. What I would point out, rather than going through the whole thing there, is that essentially carbon allowances is the only one that is quantity based. We know ahead of time when we set the carbon allowances that we're going to give out to the population. We know what emissions we're going to get from that. Whereas with the price-based ones, with the ETS and with the carbon tax, you don't know until afterwards what's going to happen. You can look back in hindsight and go, okay, we were successful, or oh, well, we completely missed it on that one. And also what I would point out is that the, going down to the second to bottom there, political ramifications of it. What we've seen with the energy crisis is that governments are very, very loath to let bills rise for their population to levels where they don't think the population are going to be able to pay, because obviously that will result in the population getting their pitchforks out and getting onto the street, and which is a kind of scary thing for politicians. So they keep they want to keep everybody happy. They want to keep the level of the fuel bills down. And so the question arises, would the carbon tax or the emissions trading scheme be politically possible when it needs to get to a level that's so high that it reduces the carbon emissions sufficiently? To a certain extent, with fee and dividend on the carbon tax, you would be able to mitigate that. But essentially as well, what you're looking at is that the carbon allowance has prevented this massive price rise because of the scarcity, because of the additional costs on top of everyday prices. And on the last line there as well, you've got the national trade borders, and you would have to bring in the mechanism at the border. For carbon allowances, it would be on everything. So you would have everything coming in. It would have to have an estimate of what the carbon price would be, and that would have to be paid by the importer. Pretty much in the same way as for carbon taxes and for the emissions trading scheme. Like, for instance, the European Union is speculating on carbon border adjustment mechanisms and how that would work. And again, with the carbon taxes and the ETS, it just dilutes the price signal again. Like, how are they going to do it? What are they going to apply it to? We don't really know, and they would have to do a lot of woolly stuff. With the carbon allowances system, it's pretty much obvious. There's a high degree of transparency there. So essentially, that is the end of it. If there's anything that I completely muddled there for you, then I'm afraid you're going to have to come back to me in the Q&A.
I might ask a few questions now, because there's a couple of points
sure.
arising before we move on to Steve. And if Steve has better answers, then by all means jump in.
Sure.
So Ed Dowding just asks about an existing voluntary carbon market, which already is used to pay climb works and to cover the costs of forests. And he says that's $2.5 billion a year. How is what you're proposing different? I guess it's more than voluntary.
Okay, to answer that question from me, the voluntary carbon market is essentially, it's very poorly regulated. It's why it's got a reputation as being a bit of a Wild West. You have so many factors that you have to take into account. And it really has to be, the regulators have to be really on the ball. And I think we've had similar problems with the Marine Stewardship Council and with the Forestry Stewardship Council, where they basically muddled and they diluted the effect. I think the voluntary carbon market is obviously useful, but I don't think it's going to get very far. I don't think it's going to produce anything like the kind of emissions that we want to achieve.
And how is the regulations going to work better in the scheme that you propose? You say the regulators aren't doing a good job in that voluntary market. What's different in your scheme?
It would be just one regulator. It would be a very strictly imposed set of guidelines about all of the different things that you need to make sure that you've got permanency. I was just about to rattle them all up, but I now realize I don't remember them all. There are about 5 different factors that you have to take into account when you're looking at an offsetting or a carbon drawdown scheme, about how much it's worth.
If I can just dive in there, Adam. The basic idea is that you would, the way that economists are trying to handle it right now which is nonsense, is carbon pricing. They try to work out what the price is on carbon to limit the damage to climate change, what they think is the optimal level of damage from climate change. In economic theory, and I don't believe most of the stuff in economic theory, but I'm using it against them here, it's equivalent to set a quantity control as it is to hit a price control. But what we're saying is their estimates of the price are ludicrous, nothing like the level that's necessary. And also financing, if you did have the right level of price, you would actually probably bankrupt the entire economy. So our idea is, say, set the quantity that everybody can consume, and then let a market develop where if the rich who get exactly the same carbon quota as us but have far more money wish to consume more carbon, they've got to buy it off people who are willing to sell it. And the people with the most carbon credits to sell would be the homeless, because they're using the lowest level of their current ration if you compare them to the median for a country. So it would be a wealth and income distribution scheme from the rich to the poor, and that would set the price at a level reflecting the willingness of the wealthy to pay to maintain as much as they could afford of their current lifestyle.
That answers a question raised by Charles Day, which is, how do you propose finding the actual price for the carbon?
Yeah, it would be found by a market system.
It's not a wise person in 10 Downing Street or somewhere else.
Can I just leap in on that, because I realise that is something I left out of the presentation. The carbon price of any particular item that you are selling would be found by its incremental build up of the price as the item is sold down the supply chain. So if it's a tank of petrol, then it's very simple. So that's set by the fuel vendor. If it's a widget or whatever, or if it's your loaf of bread, then it contains all sorts of carbon emissions from different places, and those are all added together and claimed by the baker across all of his products. So that's the way the carbon price is set, and that's the way the carbon price of everything is set. And people then go out and buy using their carbon tokens, and then. So to correct myself, that's not the way the carbon price is set. That's the way that people value carbon. And then the carbon price is set on the open market by the people selling what they've got left to the people who want more.
Two more questions before we pass on to Steve, perhaps. One is that you talked about individuals would all have allowances, but don't businesses need extra allowances because businesses are doing more than the individuals? Or for example, hospitals are doing a lot of things. Are you saying that the allowances, that the carbon consumed by the hospitals must all come out of the individual allowances of the doctors and nurses and administrators and janitors?
No, absolutely not. It would be taken out of the national budget by the government and held aside before the rest of the carbon budget is allocated to all the citizens. So it'd essentially be paid for by the government from the government's own supply that they've held in reserve for themselves.
And I'm guessing that companies will end up carbon bankrupt quite often. They will be doing things, and when it comes time for them to square their accounts, they won't have enough carbon allowances available. So what happens then? They're declared bankrupt, the directors aren't allowed to get office again?
No, I think it would just be a straight ahead bankruptcy. If they run out of carbon tokens, they have to buy more. They can't afford to buy more, then they go bankrupt.
This will not be a pure market economy where the sort of thing we led to expect by conventional economists is the market can solve everything. That's why they have this idea of a social cost of carbon and pricing what they call an externality. We are 50 years too late for that. And as economists are responsible for us delaying the response in the first instance. So this would be a sort of system with the state's capacity to create money and it will be creating a carbon tokens. I think would play a much larger role than what we are currently used to, because we've just simply allowed too much carbon through the market economy that we've built on top of cheap energy.
I'll give you the floor now, Steve, to share comments you want to bring in. There's plenty more in the chat, by the way, which I think is very good material, and we'll come back to look at what's there in due course.
My perspective really comes from being a critic of mainstream economics, which I've been for a half a century now. And I didn't get involved in climate change until after I wrote a paper that I read in 2019, based on a very simple observation that economic theory leaves energy consumption and the goal of energy and production completely out of its theory. So they have production systems where you put labor, capital, and technology in, but no energy. And that little line that I popped into my head in the middle of a friend's house when working on the same topic, labor without energy is a corpse, capital without energy is a sculpture. shows the centrality of energy to the production system. And of course, our energy is very heavily fossil fuel based. Now, when I did that, I thought I'd be diving into, this is an area of economics I hadn't tackled, the role of the way the neoclassical economists handle climate change. And I thought what I'd be doing is saying, well, they're using the wrong growth model to model it, and why their discount rate is too high. I haven't even got there, because what I found instead was they've made simply delusional assumptions about climate change. And this is one reason why, A, they've pushed a market solution, the so-called social cost of carbon, and B, why their price is so low. Because if you take a look at this stuff, it simply should never have been published. If you had decent academic standards, none of this work would have got past referees. The reason it did get past referees is pretty effectively, mainstream economists are effectively zealots for capitalism without knowing it, without being conscious of it, because they have this idea of a perfect system where you get, it's a meritocracy. You receive your marginal product, which is your contribution to society. The market reaches equilibrium, et cetera, et cetera. It's a completely false picture of capitalism, but it puts across as the world's best social system. And what that means is they innately can't imagine anything that can challenge capitalism, including climate change. So this is some of the nonsense I've been reading through. And this is one of the papers where Nordhaus first put a damage estimate for what would happen with 3 degrees of global warming. His answer was with 1/4% fall in GDP in a century would happen because of 3 degrees of global warming. And he bumped it up to 2% of GDP, which would be, of course, a much larger GDP than today, using what he called a hunch. But he's actually simply talking about the distribution of climate across the planet, as if that's what climate change is about. And then we had, when we called an expert survey with 19 people involved, 10 of whom are economists, one of whom was Larry Summers, and I'm sure Larry is responsible for the small potatoes quote, and saying also it takes a very sharp pencil to see the difference between a world with and without climate change or with and without mitigation. In other words, it's a trivial issue. And this has been the basis of the policy response by governments and the response of people in the finance sector as well, as to what danger does climate change pose for the financial system. Now, there were 2 natural scientists in that survey that Nordhaus ran who actually answered the question. One of them refused to answer the question, thought they were stupid. But their estimates are 20 to 30 times the scale of what the economists are talking about, and they were ignored. Nordhaus said it was an important research topic, but he never returned to it, never compared why did scientists have such a higher estimate of the damages from climate change. Now, what then happens is they come up with numbers like this. After he got his Nobel Prize in economics, Nordhaus published a paper in the American Economic Review where he said that a 6-degree increase in temperature would reduce GDP by 7.9%. Notice the precision. Compared to what it would have been in the absence of climate change. And that's talking in 80, 100 years' time, when per capita GDP is 3 to 4 times what it is now, you'd lose 7.9% of that 3 to 4 times larger GDP. That's back in 1991, and we actually had a paper rejected of ours by saying, well, nothing like that could be published today. Well, this is 3 papers from 2021 and 2022. A 3.67%, notice the precision there? Less GDP than from a 4-degree increase, you'd have a 3.67% lower GDP than if there was no temperature increase. 7.22 from 3.2 degrees, and tipping points. Now that's all the stuff that Adam was mentioning early on. Tipping points would reduce GDP by 1.4% compared to a world in which they didn't happen. And the tipping points they're talking about is losing Arctic summer sea ice, Greenland, West Antarctic, the Amazon, the Gulf Stream, Indian monsoon, permafrost, and ocean methane hydrates. And they're saying that'll reduce GDP by 1.4%, which is just sheer delusional nonsense. The IPCC publishes the same stuff because the same people are treated as experts and bring this nonsense forward. Whereas scientists are saying anything above 2 degrees as being existential. This is Hansen back in 2016 saying that 2 degrees of warming, also in context of losing the Gulf Stream, could generate storms in the northern Atlantic with wave sizes of 45 meters. That'd be fun, crashing down on the coast of London, the UK, wouldn't it? Stefan and O talking about the tipping cascades, and Adam's mentioned that briefly, and Lenton and Co saying it's too risky to bet against, in a recent paper finally putting a numerical value, saying 3 degrees or above and it's extreme and we're in serious trouble. Now the question is, how do economists get these low estimates? Well, they literally assume that a roof will protect you from climate change. This is the 1991 paper, and Nordhaus said there are things taken in carefully controlled environments that will not be directly affected by climate change, and then applies that to 87% of industry, all of manufacturing, even mining, utilities, finance, wholesale and retail trade, and government. Difficult to find direct impacts. That's leaving out the role of energy, which is why they reduce nonsense elements like this. The same thing from the IPCC. In other words, you know, a roof over your head and climate change is trivial. And one of the things that he argued was that you wouldn't, you know, microprocessors are made in carefully controlled environments. Well, they're shutting them down in China now because of the heat wave. So they also presume you can use today's geographic distribution of GDP and temperature to predict what's going to happen from climate change. And they also, wait for this, they have their own scientists produce what they call global circulation models, GCMs, which of course include the impact of change in rainfall levels as well as temperature and a whole lot of other variables. That's why they use supercomputers to run them. Economists, IAN, simply leave temperature and don't even have precipitation in there yet. And yet they're making all these predictions on the basis of the temperature alone. And this is the sort of bullshit language they come out with. They try to make it look pompous and scientific. Integrated assessment models often assume that other climate variables scale with temperature. What the fuck does that mean? Pardon my French here. What it means is they presume, well, if temperature gets better, so does rainfall. They move in the same direction. That's nonsense. They don't move in the same direction. They move all over the place. And what they're now doing is they're saying we can actually find the footprint for global warming in current data. So they're seeing a bit of change in temperature over the last 50 or so years, change in GDP. We can then extrapolate that and extrapolate it linearly. This is one of the papers in 2021. And you can see the grey shaded area there between a 1 and 4 degree increase in temperature. I love the spelling mistake in the down the bottom there, by the way. Even their proofreading is high quality. And then on the left-hand side, how much will GDP fall? It's a straight linear extrapolation from 2020, which is where the data goes to 2100. There's really no structural change in the temperature of the planet. Now, they also, the worst thing they do, and this is why they get these ludicrously small numbers, is they extrapolate what they've got out of current data using a quadratic. And this is the paper involving tipping points. They're saying the 1.4% decline at 6 degrees warming based on a second order polynomial, which is a fancy way of saying a parabola. Okay, it's just trying to intimidate us with trivial language. Again, the same thing. The assumption that losses rise quadratically, same sort of story. And that's what a quadratic looks like. So this is from one of the early papers. And the quadratic's coefficient is 0.0032. So for at least each temperature, degree temperature squared, you get 0.0032, less than 1/3 of 1%, in other words, increase in that temperature. But why are these quadratic? Because they just like them. Quadratics are easy. When they do their optimization, the derivative of a quadratic is a straight line, so it makes it easy to do optimization cost-benefit analysis. That's the only reason they use it. And they've been bashed about this and simply ignored all the criticisms, including people saying it's made up of thin air and getting that into an academic paper. So what I'm going to do here is show what happens when you extrapolate, but do it properly. It's nonsense to say we can find a decent footprint in current data, but I'm going to take that assumption and see what happens when you extrapolate it in a different way. So there's a database maintained by NOAA, and I love this. I love the acronym here, National Oceanic Administration of America. It's a database of all climatic crises which have caused $1 billion or more worth of damage in the last 60 or so years. And that's the plot over time as a percentage of GDP against the temperature anomaly for the same period of time. So what I've done is I've taken that and I've fitted the data using a quadratic an exponential and a logistic function. And literally that the line you can see down there going through those dot points, those are the three functions. You simply cannot tell them apart from current data. What happens when you extrapolate them? Okay. Well, it's on the other side. Now, what they're telling you, it's the blue line. What it's likely to be is the brown line, the exponential, because you can't destroy more than 100% of the GDP. But either the exponential or the logistic shows us what we're likely to see, and that means that there's no economy left after 3 degrees. And that's much closer to what scientists are telling us. We need this level of urgency to do something serious about climate change. So the nonsense that they use quadratics to extrapolate this is just not is dangerous, because what it's saying is nothing to worry about until the 22nd century. Okay? What we're saying is we're worried about it now, and if we put it in terms of time, again using the exponential plot there, you could say there'll be nothing left by 2060. This is going to happen not in the lifetime of our children, but our own lifetimes. And this is why it's so serious to do something about it now. So we need to change the framing from optimization, which is how economists have framed it, to existential risk. And that's part of the reason why we're talking about this rationing approach, because what we've got to realize, we're in a war which we've started against ourselves. And so to fight that war, we've got to fight it like we fought the Second World War, and that's put everything we possibly can into mitigation and reversing the damage we've done, and limit what we do in terms of consumption. And that's a major principle behind the idea of this, of the dual carbon pricing. And it's not, we don't want to end up in the world of hothouse Earth, which Adam mentioned earlier from Stefan's work, but that's where we're headed. Unless we do something to ration our carbon consumption rapidly. And we need something in place before the crisis starts to destroy the capacity to manage the civilization. Because some of the dangers we face, and they could happen in the next 10 to 20 years, could mean the end of the capacity to have large-scale agriculture. And this is the sort of, we haven't yet woken up to it. But when we wake up to it, we can't be using market mechanisms or anything like that. We've got to be ready for something more drastic. And that's the large idea behind the idea of the carbon pricing. So I'm happy to leave it at that point and come back and take some questions and discussion.
Many thanks, Steve. So there are quite a few comments in the chat now. Let's start with how this scheme that you're proposing would work internationally, because as has been pointed out by Charles Day, current emissions trading schemes set very different prices in different parts of the world. Does it make any sense for one country to be pioneering this, or does it need some global coordination for agreement on the scheme everywhere at once?
It could happen from an international level. And I think one of the reasons that we've done so little is we've relied upon international agreements. And actually the fossil fuel companies are happy to have us do that because they know you'll never make an agreement. All you need is one stick out country and nothing gets done. So this is something which you could bring at the national level instead and do it straight away.
Let me pick the question of, isn't there things we should be doing more urgently? There was a question raised by Yuan, if I can find it again here. Yuan says, look, isn't there a higher priority? There's a $6 trillion per annum of subsidies enjoyed by the fossil fuel industry. Isn't that a simpler and more effective way to change the behavior of these companies if these subsidies are removed?
The question, how do you want to bankrupt them? Okay.
We don't particularly want to bankrupt them. We want
well,
them
you would.
to...
If you take out $6 trillion out of their budget, they'd go bankrupt. I'm not saying let's not do that. It's okay, but you have to realize on the scale we're talking about, if you can actually, and I've seen that figure floated around. I haven't seen where it's been derived from. I think a lot of it is saying they're not paying for the damages, and the damages are estimated level. I don't think they're given a subsidy of $6 trillion. That is, what is the America? That's 1/3 of America's GDP. I'm just not sure that much money is going in actual cash in hand to fossil fuel companies from governments around the world. But nonetheless, they're not paying for their costs, and the major costs are the hidden costs of global warming. So we're saying, well, let's just put a price on the carbon that's causing it initially.
I'd add that essentially there's no reason not to do them simultaneously. You start reducing the subsidies and you start introducing the carbon currency at the same time.
Question from Anna. How would individual citizens actually sell their excess carbon allowances to other citizens? Are you imagining some kind of eBay system or other online?
Fundamentally, an electronic system. I'll be designing a mock-up when I have time, which, you know, I need 2 or 3 clones to get my work level done. But the basic idea is we currently we have a monetary distribution system run through private banks and the central bank. You'd have a carbon credit system run through a carbon bank, as Adam was saying earlier. And we all get the same amount into our accounts every day. We'd run them down by buying, by shopping. But if and this is our argument way of bringing it in a way that won't be too aggressive initially for people to cope with, you could bring it in at the current average for each country. And as Adam said, that would be about 7,000, was it 7,000 kilos, Adam? Yeah. Per person per year in the UK. But for the vast majority, like 90 to 95% of the population, don't use that much. So they would have excess. But the people, the wealthy ones, would run out very rapidly and have to buy it. So you could have an electronic market system. You'd literally have carbon dioxide is the ultimate homogeneous non-commodity. Okay, one carbon dioxide model is the same as any other. So you don't have the hassles of a differentiated market system. You could simply say, here's the level. If you want to bid it, you get your share of it, then this is the market price at the moment for that quantity. And it would have an enormous impact upon the distribution of income and the opposite direction of most policies. It would actually skew it in favor of the poor rather than the rich. I'm not saying there wouldn't be problems, by the way. But it would be very, very difficult, and it'd be unexpected outcomes, I'm sure. So you'd need to test it and change as things go through.
Watch it carefully, consider the surprises arising, and be able to be nimble without being steamrolled by vested interests who come up with clever explanations. This figure of 7,000 per person per year in the UK, how much does that take into account the fact that the government would have to ring-fence portions for hospitals, as we said, and probably a large amount for military as well? How much might that 7,000 come down by for these central allocations?
I'm waiting for a grant to do the research into that.
Yeah.
Okay.
This is the hypothetical idea. So yes, there are lots of areas where we don't know the answer to those questions. We have to find them out.
Yes.
And also there would be, I mean, there's issues too with how do you give them to companies. It's easy to do a per capita basis across the country. In terms of individual distribution, how do you handle companies inside there? Really, we've got to work that out. But saying the idea of using the quantity rather than the price is what we try to set. And we know what quantity we have in terms of that, you know, the mythical budget for a 1.5 degrees increase. So we can actually specify what level of carbon would cause that. That's much more accuracy than we can do on the price level. The neoclassical estimates for the price of carbon range between $0 and $1,100 per tonne. And that's with the shit logic that I showed you earlier. Okay?
Take a question by Cedric Knight, who asks, are we any closer to international agreements on dividing emission or extraction caps than we were 20 years ago?
Nope.
Well, you and I saw, Steve, on Twitter the other day, some person who felt he was speaking up on behalf of the developing world, saying basically, how dare you Westerners tell us in our developing countries how much energy to burn? So there's some hostility there. So we're not closer to that, but I think you were saying earlier, in a sense, we don't need that agreement first because it's worthwhile implementing this nationally.
This can be done at the national level. And that's one reason, again, that I like the idea, because everything else we require to get agreement between India and Pakistan and the UK and Australia and Russia, et cetera, you're not going to get it. If you may have seen, there was a documentary made by, I've forgotten the group, but they decided to scam a lobby group in Washington, arguing as if they were looking for lobbying services to defend fossil fuels. And this lobbyists were bragging about how effective they were in stopping anything happening by agreeing to have international agreements. So international agreement, I think humans' capacity to walk on that level is pretty close to zero. And so if you make that our defence line, we're not going to have a defence line. Whereas if you do it from the national level, then you bring it in straight away and you don't need to worry about whether you get agreement from another country.
David Dewhurst asks, how are we going to monitor where all the emissions are taking place? We might try and watch to see, for example, the cows are emitting greenhouse gases of various sorts, but aren't we going to need a huge police force to ensure that people are all accounting properly for all the emissions that are made?
You're going to need accounting definitely on a grand scale. We already have a lot of that. I mean, if any products you buy at the supermarket, try not to find details of the constituents of those products. It's part of the current regulatory regime for goods and services that we monitor what the components going into those are. So it's not an enormous increase in the bureaucracy. But like Charles Day's got a question there, why not just use money? If you use money, the wealthy don't. Money doesn't affect the wealthy as much as it affects the poor. Look at the riots that are happening right now in Italy and Germany and parts of the UK over energy bills. And if you have it on a monetary base alone, it's the poor who pay for it, not the wealthy.
But it will be much harder to set up a new parallel currency than to impose taxes.
Yeah, I mean, my thinking is partly that it was pretty hard to put up rationing during the Second World War too, but it was done.
Right, so in rationing in the Second World War, it didn't matter that you had more money because you were restricted to how many eggs you could buy a week.
Yeah. In this case, you'd say if you want to buy more eggs, you can buy them off somebody else effectively, but you've got to pay for them.
When we're talking about doing it at the national level, there's always the problem of things sort of being outsourced overseas. So in Britain, in some sense, can point to declining greenhouse gas emissions, but only because we're getting more from abroad. And so, in a sense, we're transferring our burden overseas and still paying for the goods arising. How does that get taken account of in this accounting system?
I touched on the carbon border adjustment mechanism that would have to be put in place so that carbon price for each item that's imported is either estimated or basically put on there so that the importer pays it to the customs when it's imported. That would also sort out the problem with with high carbon foreign imports trying to undercut domestic production. You wouldn't be able to. They'd be given a carbon price that made the competition fair.
That was a question posed by Angus Ross, I see. Correct. With both of us thought of the same question at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
So you have thought about the mechanism. It'll be complicated, but with sufficient attention, with the sufficient people working on it, sufficient economists, sufficient other bright people, it's not beyond the wit of humankind to come up with schemes that work.
I think the idea of complexity is not necessarily as good as the idea that it's just extensive. There's nothing particularly complex about it. It's just massively extensive and covers everything. Just to make a point there.
Well, that's interesting. So that's a better way of selling it, as it were, which brings us to a question that Anna Plodowski asks in the Q&A, highest voted. What are the ways, what are the key selling points to persuade governments to do this, given that governments are very distracted by all kinds of other ideas all the time?
Yeah. I think the governments would be very, very loath to do anything like this and won't do it in time. Okay, so being frank about it, I don't think we're going to get this in ahead of schedule. But the one thing which governments are doing right now is talking about central bank digital currencies. Sort of a bit of a fad generated by cryptocurrencies. So a central bank digital currency could be repurposed for this. So what I want is something like have the electronic structure in place, a central bank digital currency, prior to doing anything about climate change. And then once it happens, you could rapidly repurpose it for the sort of carbon trading we're talking about, the parallel currency. It could be set up initially as if it's a way to distribute, typical government money to citizens through the current. Like I know in the UK, you didn't have anything like the tax rebate system Australia used to give people a stimulus during the global financial crisis, and it was going to take 6 months to set it up. Well, this would be set up and it could be used for that purpose. But then once you realize just how serious climate change is, and that's what we don't have yet, the real serious exceptions, just how dangerous this is, then you could repurpose it. If you don't have it before the crisis becomes obvious, then I can't see it being developed once the crisis starts either.
This is one of the things futurists or foresight specialists want to do. It's to put the ideas into people's minds. So even if people say, well, we're not going to do that when the crisis comes, it's a bit like the air hostess who says, well, if there is a crash, you're going to look under your seats and find the safety jackets. And by the way, you should look at the ground because there'll be lights illuminating the way to the exits. And most of us don't pay much attention, but at least we're paying a little bit of attention. If we're in that terrible situation, we'll think, hey, yes, this is what to do. So these CBDCs, to be clear, they're nothing to do with blockchain or cryptocurrencies. They're just a central digital mechanism. Is that correct?
Yeah, they're the idea is you would never go to you'd never be a branch of the central bank you go to get money out for shopping. So it'd all be electronic. Therefore, it's digital. But it doesn't have to have the blockchain. It doesn't have to have shared ledgers. It could be a single ledger maintained as the central bank does itself. But rather than having just 20 or 30 elements, which is the scale of current central bank accounts for banks and the treasury and primary dealers and so on, it would be, in the UK's case, 50 million accounts.
Ed Dowding raises a question about, in this scenario, farmers, landowners could become, in a way, wealthy because they're paid to capture carbon dioxide or control it in some way. Do you imagine that there will be people who do very well financially out of this proposal?
I see it going more to the homeless. I mean, because they do carbon capture. We haven't actually even spoken about the idea of including carbon capture and getting a rebate. This is the whole idea of saying everybody gets the same allowance on a daily basis, and that's what you expend. So they, if you had a scheme where you could get a rebate for reducing carbon, but that's not part of what we're talking about at the moment. It may well be part of the scheme, a scheme if it ever came about, but it's not part of our idea at the moment.
That's a bolt-on from me, Steve.
Okay, all right.
Bolt-on component that I've been pushing.
You had an acronym CDR. Is that carbon drawdown or is it?
Carbon dioxide removal.
Carbon dioxide removal, right.
Yeah, Climeworks is the famous one. They have the carbon dioxide removal machines in Iceland. And they pump the CO2 below ground, and it crystallizes in rocks.
So if this scheme was in place, it would provide a lot more incentive for more companies like Climeworks, and they would accelerate to try and find other ways to draw carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere.
Yeah, and it would also encourage people shopping, the wealthy in terms of what they spend, to again rapidly support decarbonised industries.
There's a question by Cedric Knight. He says that what we've been talking about, life cycle emissions for some products, should the carbon charge for a new fridge be based just on its manufacturing or also related to the fridge's efficiency? Because certain fridges will consume less electricity and have fewer emissions going forwards. So is that something you want to add into your scheme? I'm not entirely sure I'm capturing Cedric's question correctly. So Cedric, if I've misunderstood, please add some more. The
carbon price on the energy used to run the fridge would be paid to the energy provider, the domestic energy provider, where the fridge is housed. So it doesn't have anything to do with the actual manufacturing of the fridge. So if somebody's clever, then they'll buy a very efficient fridge because they know that they're going to have to pay for their energy with carbon tokens as well as cash.
Is there anything else that we've been talking about that you feel needs to be gone into in a bit more detail? Because you had lots of fascinating material, Adam, and I feel that it would be worth maybe bringing up your slide again of comparing the three schemes, for example.
I can do that.
It may be worth reviewing the points in there compared to alternative mechanisms which are already in place. There are emissions trading schemes and there are proposals for carbon tax. Is there anything else you'd like to emphasize on here as to why the carbon allowance scheme is likely to succeed or could succeed, whereas these other two schemes couldn't?
We've already got a carbon tax with fee and dividend in Canada. We've had one in Sweden. We've got one in Sweden, I mean, and there are various other ones. And we've got a very famous, or rather infamous, emissions trading scheme in Europe. So going on current evidence, I just would be very pessimistic about their chances. I think we just need something else. It's essentially, it just provides a mechanism for business as usual to say, oh, look, put a carbon tax in place, or we've got this emissions trading scheme. So we're doing what we can, but I don't think the results are going to be up to the task, up to the challenge.
Yeah, and take a look at that graph that Adam had about the level of carbon being emitted. It's just been rising exponentially. But all the schemes we've put in so far, we've still got an exponential rise in the level of carbon we're putting into the atmosphere. That can't keep on happening. So our idea is, say, let's tackle it directly. Set up a scheme where there's a physical amount which can be absorbed by a country per year, and then put a price mechanism which drastically discourages the consumption of carbon-based products, both by the wealthy, which are the major consumers, but also by dramatically encouraging a reduction in the carbon intensity of goods in the economy, because that's one way that they can pay less for carbon.
To make it more politically acceptable to start off with, could you initially offer overly large carbon allowances so that it wouldn't stop the emissions straight away, or wouldn't break it quite so quickly, but people would get used to the idea, and it would be clear that in 2 or 3 years' time, the allowances would be set at the proper level?
You could do that. I mean, we're talking about using the average right now, which, I mean, I'm not sure of the actual distribution, but if you said everybody gets the average per capita allowance on a daily basis over an annual cycle, then the bottom 95% of the population would probably not consume that allowance, would just accumulate in their carbon bank accounts. So that might even be enough. I mean, we got with the Tory voter syndrome in the UK and similar one in Australia and Republicans in America, you could get it very politically effective. So you could set it to level where 99% of the population got more than they would consume, and only the top 1% paid. And then you could try that and then bring it down from that level.
I think it's a political game. You have to look at the different factors involved. What it would need really politically is to be introduced and embedded at a level that won't affect most of the voters, so that when the screw does start being turned and people are then impacted, that they won't all go and vote for the next populist party that comes along that proposes to rip it out. And then the question is, if you've got the rise of populist parties like you've got in Europe because of all of this stuff going down with wars and extreme weather and whatever, then are we ever going to be in a situation where we could introduce something like this? What are the chances of a government like Italy now has, of introducing something? I don't know. It's a very difficult one. It's a conversation that could take you. You'd need to have a professor of politics with huge experience in this kind of thing to be able to weigh up all of the different factors involved. Like Steve said, there are grounds to be really pessimistic about it.
Sometimes politicians can do surprising things once they're in power. Sometimes they do much worse than were expected, but sometimes somebody who was from a rather unpleasant party, once they're in power, they can realize, hey, this is what needs to be done. And they can carry their electorate with them to an extent, perhaps. But again, I say, you had these two columns in the side here, and you said, well, these aren't working and they're unlikely to work. But what gives you the confidence that the one in the middle, which hasn't been tried at all yet, is more likely to work rather than refining either the carbon tax or the emission trading schemes?
Well, the carbon currency hasn't been introduced anywhere in across the whole economy, but you have had a lot of trials of personal carbon trading, where people have been given a personal carbon budget to use. Like, for instance, in Helsinki, they ran one a couple of years ago, or maybe just last year they finished it off. And it was based around transport, so that you spent your carbon on your tanks of petrol, and much less so on train tickets and tram tickets and buses and so on. And they rewarded people who had allowances left over at the end of this period with stuff that the state could provide for free, like I think they were offering free tickets to swimming pools and free parking and so on. Well, probably not free parking, but something like that. And they had significantly better results from the people who are in the personal carbon trading trials. They were able to reduce their carbon emissions significantly compared to people who had just said, well, we're going to try on our own, see how well we can do it.
The other side is too that if you look at the carbon pricing, and that's what gave rise to the Gilets jaunes in France a few years back before COVID, and another universe. And it was more done as a budget trick by Macron than actually trying to address climate change. But of course, people are already on the edge. You put the price up that much, they've got a choice: do they fuel the car or feed the kids? And that's why they put on the yellow jackets, and you have riots and et cetera, et cetera. This scheme would benefit initially the bottom 95% of the population. And the poorer you are, the more you'd benefit from it. So the idea is this is actually politically palatable, whereas everything else, by putting up costs on everybody, is politically unpalatable to, and most effectively to those at the bottom end of the scale, because they can then fall for the Bjorn Lomborg type arguments, we shouldn't do anything about it.
Let's take a few more questions from the Q&A. Top voted question this time is that not everybody in society is that clever. How would, quotes, unclever people cope with this proposal? Because we might be used to the idea of money, but having two currencies at the same time, isn't that going to be too difficult or confusing?
Not when I've seen people playing with their mobile phones on trains all the time. If you actually were getting a dynamically updated price, you had your own consumption level, and you know how much you've got of your own buffer left ahead of you. You could have an app telling you you're quite safe to sell 80% of your allowance, for example. Sell 90%, you're in trouble. You won't be able to buy bread for the kids, but 80% you're going to be comfortable. And then at that level, do you want to sell 80%, et cetera, et cetera? You could also, we haven't worked this out fully either yet, but the one possibility, have depreciating tokens. You don't lose them, they expire. There's various possibilities like that to encourage use or sale. But it's certainly the fact that they'd be generate a large amount of wealth, something saleable by people who otherwise can only sell their labor, and even they're having a hard time.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually, because you don't want the big companies being able to stockpile their tokens while they're cheap, which they've been doing in the ETS.
Yeah.
There's a question from Charles Day, which I'm not sure I understand, but I'll ask it anyway. What's the carbon price of having a child? I don't think we need to, in your scheme, I don't think you need to pay anything for having a child. It's just that, I guess.
Oh, the child, unless you buy them at the local safe outlet, we're not far from that level of neoliberalism, are we? Okay. Anything you buy is going to have a carbon price. If you create it yourself, you pay for the nappies. You don't buy the child.
I think the child would get their own carbon tokens, their own carbon allowance. Probably not the same as an adult, but
yeah, we'd have some sort of age limit on this, sort of maybe 16. Where you get an account of 16 and above, that sort of thing.
Well, if you were adopting a child from abroad, then that would certainly come into the matter. Certainly come into the question. But yeah, essentially, you would be totally responsible for the carbon used by your dog or your cat, for instance. But for your
child. Well, I think a child up to 16, yeah, that sort of thing. You've got to pay the price.
No, I've got a teenage daughter. She's not 16 yet. I don't really want to be responsible for her carbon footprint.
Yes.
So introduce it around about when they start school, maybe.
Possibly it should be a sliding scale.
Yeah.
But it means each time a child is born, does that diminish the allowance for the rest of us? Or whenever a child comes into the population, whether they're 16 or a sliding scale, does that reduce the amount of carbon credits available for the rest of us?
Absolutely.
I think that's the logic, isn't
growth,
it?
yeah.
I think we've discussed this already, but let's have another go at it from Charles. Can you outline the mechanism by which the government will determine and set this individual annual carbon allowance? I guess it's going to be a complicated thing like setting the budget.
Not really, no. How many thousand tons are you allowed? What's the allowance for your country? And that is where you're going to have issues. Or the easy way is say, what's the average right now? Okay, how much carbon does the UK consume on an annual basis now? Divide that by per capita above 16. Everybody gets that daily allowance pumped out. And if you use more than that, you've got to buy some of the allowance off other people. It's actually quite a simple scheme.
But there has to be things set aside for special cases, such as the
hospitals
military and
so on. Yeah, there would be complications for sure, but nonetheless, the basic idea is what do you consume right now? Work out an individual allocation, work out the elements of social allocation, the NHS and so on. But yeah, it's a simple numerical calculation. It's not an allocation exercise by a bureaucrat.
What's been the response of observers, other economists or other activists to this proposal in as much as they've understood it and listened to it?
I think silence is a good answer there, isn't it, Adam?
I was going to say, I've talked to people and essentially a lot of people say it's never going to happen. But then they also tend to think that it's never going to happen, that climate change is going to completely trash the planet. So, you know, I always go back to Steve, to what you say is that if we don't do something like this, then we'll have to do something like this anyway.
Yeah.
If we don't do something like this now, then we'll have to do a much more.
I don't think people who are thinking. I mean, yes, this idea is very, very simplistically laid out at the moment. But if we don't do something like this, then we're going to use Mad Max methods instead. And the scale of the dangers we face, the type of social breakdown that this could cause. Just people don't comprehend, I think, just how serious and how close this is. So we're going to need to ration, frankly. I think capitalism's days are numbered because we've pushed consumption far past what the planet can sustain. And when we start, not if, we start realizing that we've drastically disturbed the climate to the stage at which sedentary civilization may no longer be possible, then we've got to do something. And that something will involve rationing. And if we don't have rationing in place before it happens, we'll have other ways of rationing after it happens. And, you know, go and watch your most recent Mad Max movie for what that could be if we don't have a social system in place.
So on the messaging, is there a risk that if you talk about capitalism's days are numbered, you potentially alienate some of the allies? Talking about rationing is less of a jump up because, after all, there's been rationing in the past of capitalism in crisis times. I thought that was a good example.
And that's the idea. So we've got to look at this in the same way we did World War II rationing. And that was to minimize the amount of productive capacity going into people's consumption and maximize the amount available for the war effort. And a similar thing here. But we simply, you know, we didn't start rationing in the Second World War until after Dunkirk. Now we're going to have a Dunkirk for climate. And I just want something in place before that happens rather than trying to put it in place after.
And what's going to be the Dunkirk for climate?
Take your pick. China's 100-day drought so far, breakdown of food systems in North America or Europe. You know, the type of stuff which scientists are talking about as feasible is just not getting through to the public. And like probably my favorite there to give an example is from James Anderson, who's professor of chemistry at Harvard University and the person who both discovered and led the campaign to close the hole in the ozone layer in the Arctic back in the 80s and 90s. And his research, and he's not part of the mainstream in this sense, but he says when we lose the Arctic, we will lose the 3 circulation patterns in the northern hemisphere. They'll go from 3 circulation cells to 1. That will therefore mean that the stratosphere becomes a moist stratosphere rather than the dry stratosphere it currently is. That moisture coming in from the troposphere will also bring in ozone depleting chemicals, chlorine and bromide, and they will destroy the ozone layer. Now that starts happening, you know, there is no northern hemisphere civilization. Now people are disputing whether the degree of ozone depletion will be as severe as Anderson says it could be, or will it be just mean you get more ultraviolet, but not to the stage where you can't literally go outdoors during daylight hours. But it could be either extreme. We don't know. And so
hopefully we'll get sufficient early warning, just as the ozone layer was detected before too many people got skin cancer as a result.
Well, I think that's optimistic. So we shouldn't even be getting near where we can consider these possibilities, but we are. And so we're saying we need some sort of mechanism in place before that happens. Otherwise, we really are not going to have a civilization to defend.
What I'm going to do is briefly talk about what's coming next with London Futurists, and then I'll come back to the two of you to have the chance to highlight things which you think deserve to be on viewers' minds as we are coming to the end of the event. Let me turn off my screen here. So we've had this provocative, challenging, innovative presentation today. London Futurists is coming back in 7 days' time on a slightly different note. There is on Sunday, Monday and Tuesday of this week in Dubai, something that's portrayed as the world's largest gathering of futurists in this building, which is the Museum of the Future. So I will be there along with a bunch of others, and there are 30 sessions, including one on sustainable energy transition and how to effect this worldwide, along with lots of other sessions on how can the ideas of foresight, such as we've been discussing here, actually be turned into real political policies. So what we'll be doing in a week's time from today is the number of people who are at this event have agreed to share their debrief in a webinar. What might change in the world of futurism as a result of this event in Dubai. Looking further ahead, that's to the end of this month, on the Saturday and the Sunday, there is a chance for futurists to meet physically at the London School of Economics at an event organised both by former students and current students of the LSE. 2 days on 6 themes: the future of work, cyber society, cities of tomorrow, Planet Hope, which includes ideas on combating climate change and dealing with other resource pressures, healthcare for humanity, and some people looking at moving into space and further frontiers. So I'm expecting a lot of interesting things happening at that event, some very serious discussions, as well possibly as some less serious discussions, when I'm encouraging all members of London Futurists and friends to consider registering and meeting up in the flesh there after having been separated for so long in the COVID days. I should also mention a podcast that Callum Chase and myself have started recently. We have now released our 7th episode, and there is more coming soon. That can be found on all good providers of podcasts. The episodes are typically between 30 and 35 minutes each. That brings us back to today's events, which have given us a lot to think about. I'm not sure the audience is yet completely convinced, according to the chat, but we can dive into that perhaps informally in a few minutes after a comfort break for those who want to continue the conversation. I'll give everybody the chance who's still here after a bio break to turn on their microphones and their screens for comments. But first, Adam and Steve, what would you like to conclude with?
Shall I go first?
Yep.
Basically, we're all living in well, I assume most of us on here are all in the developed world. We're all living in a what's a carbon bubble. And when we withdraw, when we exit that carbon bubble in times like this, at this presentation with David, we realize what's going on, and we realize the seriousness of everything. And then we go off again, and tomorrow, day after, the rest of the week, we go back, we withdraw back into our carbon bubble. And then everything that we talked about here becomes, oh, well, no, actually, you know, it sounded like a good idea, but is it going to happen? It's not going to happen. Oh, that's just like, it's a psychology thing. So basically, I mean, I spend most of my time doing the communications for EcoCore, trying to get a message out there that is going to garner support to advocate for this, which basically segues in quite nicely into, if this does inspire you and you like this concept and you want to support it, then please go to the EcoCore website, and you'll find the link to a Patreon account there, and that would be massively appreciated. So thanks.
And you got more details of the proposal on that site as well.
Yeah.
Thanks. Steve, final thoughts?
Well, mainly that we have been drastically conned by economists who've conned themselves about the seriousness of the issues we face, and that's why we've done so little. I call the fossil fuel companies might well be waging the war against climate change, but the arms are being manufactured by economists. So a major part of what we need is to realize just how bad the work of economists has been, and not to take them seriously, and get them out of policy advice, get to engineers and other social and non-economic social scientists and climate scientists rather than economists. On that basis, my Patreon also needs assistance, and that's patreon.com/PropSteveKeen, where I continue waging this battle against economists.
And there was a question earlier, Steve, whether your slides, in fact, both sets of slides from this would be available.
Yep,
actually,
that's
Steve,
fine.
you had huge amounts of detail that you skimmed through. So they can find that perhaps on your website, or we'll provide links in the video description.
Yeah, I'll send them to you, David, and they're up on my website on Patreon.
Well, I want to thank the two of you very much for trying to make us all consider this topic. Otherwise, we'll go back to being influenced by the thoughts of long dead economists who we've never heard of, but who sort of convince us, hey, everything's going to be all right sooner or later. And that's a delusion that we need to break out of, and you're helping us to break out of that delusion. Something radical is clearly needed. Perhaps what you're proposing, probably a combination of this and one or two other things as well. So I want to thank you for pushing forward this conversation.
Welcome. Thank you for the invitation.